Okay, folks, thanks very much for being here. If you can't see me, stand up, please, and feel free to stand up. I know it's that time of day when you're starting to get a little bit itchy to move on and have lunch. I'm going to talk to you about the environmental mitigation policy. Some of you have heard of the environmental mitigation policy, some have not. It is a provincial policy, and you'll learn something new today. I'll be talking about an overview, just telling you what is it, when do you use it, why do you use it. Okay, and I'll also be talking about offsets because I think a lot of people are very interested in what is the concept of offsetting and when could you use it in terms of migratory bird, so-called incidental take. The environmental mitigation policy came about through several years of development in 2009 to 2014 as a result of concerns about past issues about decisions about offsetting, because there was inconsistency and there wasn't transparency about how the decisions were made, and there was no accountability for those decisions, and the decisions weren't thought to be very efficient. In April of 2014, the Natural Resources Board, our deputy minister level board for the natural resource agencies in British Columbia, approved and endorsed the policy for implementation across the NR sector. By that endorsement, they made it government policy for our agencies. So those of you who are in the room who are from one of those natural resource agencies, if you haven't heard about it yet, you should have. We have had training and it's time to learn about it. So I'll teach you all about it today as well. And it's not just a policy that applies to government staff. So those of you who aren't government staff, pay attention as well. So who is our target audience? Of course, those provincial staff who are providing information to decision makers. They're providing advice and information for decisions and recommending actions around environmental values and protecting them. Of course, our target audience includes the decision makers, those statutory decision makers. And it is a decision support tool, not a decision-making tool. It supports the decision. It can be used to help make a decision about mitigation. And for the proponents, it provides guidance on developing a mitigation plan. Whatever statute you're operating underneath requires some kind of mitigation planning. This provides that guidance. There are no legal requirements for the proponent to follow this policy. We'll get to that in a second. But one of the values of the proponents about knowing about the policy is that many times you're sitting across the table from a government person or submitting an application to a government process, and the government staff will be reviewing your proposal, your application, your request for a permit with this policy in mind. And the language and the concepts and the requirements of that policy will be considered. So what is the policy? First of all, it is a very small document. It's like 6 pages long. And it has some very strong policy statements in it. And one of them is that all feasible measures are considered at one level of the mitigation hierarchy before moving to the next level. First, consider all measures to avoid, and once those have been considered, move on to considering those measures that might be minimizing, and once those have been considered, move to the next step of restoration on site, and only at that point, consider offsets. That's the key point. The other is that those mitigation activities on the ground, whether it's so-called mitigation or offsetting actions, should be directly linked to the impact. Habitat loss impact, habitat loss mitigation action. And the policy also states that there should be a document, rationalizing all the actions and prepared in a mitigation plan. The procedures document is much bigger. It's like 64 pages long. And it provides the guidance on how to do this, how to do it well. It provides principles and concepts that help you see why we're following that mitigation policy, and all the best guidance about putting together the mitigation plan and thinking particularly about offsets. So everybody's seen one version or another of a mitigation hierarchy. This is the one that's illustrated in our policy. avoid, minimize, and restore on site. There's some examples of techniques for avoiding, minimizing, and restoring. At that point, once you've got to restoring on site, that's where the decision maker is going to have to stop and say, there's some kind of a residual impact. Is it acceptable for the permit or authorization to continue or not? And if it's not, what else can be done? And an offset may be considered at that point. But what the decision maker, getting information from that environmental staff, a biologist or ecologist or whatever, will be looking at the size and character of that residual impact before moving to considering what the offset might be. Now, in practice, what does this mean? Okay, so you've got a horizontal line there that's describing the condition of an environmental component, habitat quality, for instance, for a songbird or for a plant or whatever. Out on the right end is a current condition of your environmental component. It can be good, it can be mediocre, wherever it is. That's where at current state. There's a potential impact going to happen, brings it down to some lower level. If you can avoid it, great. We keep the current condition of that environmental component. If you minimize, partially avoid, use those techniques, best management practices, etc., you can bring the quality or the predicted quality of the end point of that current condition would be closer to the current condition. So you're bringing it back up, but you don't quite get back up to the current condition. You might have to, in a particular case, also have to do some restoration on site. Where these lines are here is very arbitrary, just for illustrative purposes, of course. You might get quite close in your prediction of how, when you're avoiding, minimizing, and on-site restoration, you might get quite close back to that current condition. You may not. And that residual impact before offset is that key point in that diagram, again, for characterizing what you're going to consider for an offset and how to consider it. Now, this diagram shows my offsetting or my residual impact line coming right back to the current condition. I want to point out that the environmental mitigation policy is not a no net loss policy. It's not a requirement of the policy to get back to no net loss. However, the statutory decision maker, upon advice, may choose to have that as the goal. The goal could be, in fact, getting back to a better than situation, or it could be not getting to that current condition. That's up to the statutory decision maker. So what are the legal implications? I want to get back to that statement that I said that it's voluntary or it doesn't have the legal weight. So the EMP doesn't convey legal authority. The reason is because it's not connected directly to any statute in particular. There's no legal teeth to it, it's just a policy. However, it supports all our existing legislation and many of our legal requirements that you folks are operating under. Any of the activities that you're conducting still have to be carried out in according to the relevant legislation and the terms and conditions of all your permits and everything. If you're not following the environmental mitigation policy, we can't charge you under not following the environmental mitigation policy, but it may be used as a tool to help you actually meet the right requirements under the authority and permit that you have in place. So you might have a permit or an authorization under any one of these natural resource sector statutes. There are many places in these statutes where the statutory decision maker has the discretion to add conditions and terms to your authorization. In the different statutes, that authority varies. We know that. The Environmental Assessment Act, the Environmental Management Act, the Water Sustainability Act, and the Land Act, only those four, either specifically or indirectly, but that's how it's interpreted, allow offsetting. The others all allow mitigation. They all allow mitigation. None of them specifically, of those four, none of them specifically speak to any kind of a cash transaction for an offset. So when we're talking about a financial offset, it's not specifically allowed or enabled under any of these statutes. Historically, they've been done through creative accounting. And that's likely to continue. So we'll go, and I'll talk to that as well. Under any of these statutes, of course, there is a requirement to prepare something like a mitigation plan, a management plan. You may have other terminology that you're familiar with. How are you going to mitigate your impact on certain things? The mitigation plan in itself that the proponent applies to the government for a permit with may specify a voluntary offset measure. They've sat at the table and they've said, we have planned all this mitigation. We anticipate that there will be some kind of a residual impact. The statutory decision maker or staff have spoken with the person and said, that's just not enough. It's still a significant impact on that particular value. What else can we do? And the proponent may offer a voluntary offset, conservation offset or financial offset. Once that becomes part of the application, and the application gets approved, stapled together with the permit, that voluntary offset becomes a legal obligation of the contract. So once it's volunteered, it becomes legal, and it's managed under the authority of the authorization and the statute under which the permit is allowed. So that if you don't live up to your offset obligations under that permit, it's still under that Mines Act or that Environmental Assessment Act that you would be brought to task. But it's quite complex, as you can imagine, because I'm giving you lots of waffle words here and it's not straightforward, so it is complex. Each one of these offsets has to be managed individually. It's case by case. So when would the government think of implementing the environmental mitigation policy? Well, when there's a new or existing authorization where some kind of a statutory decision is required, primarily for those permitting and authorizations. The decision maker will decide whether or not what's being proposed, where and what amount is acceptable. And it's usually, from the government's perspective, that the EMP would be used for major projects, Environmental Assessment Act projects. That's the context under which the policy was developed. However, the concepts and principles in this mitigation procedures document, which is supporting the policy itself, can be applied at much smaller scales and is being applied at much smaller scales than just those large and major projects. But some of those major projects might be large, there might be multiple projects on the land base. They could be extensive and have a collective footprint that's quite substantial, or collective impact that's quite substantial. And there may be permanent damage that, and under these circumstances, that's certainly when government wants to have the environmental mitigation policy used for helping to make those decisions. As well, there may be projects that require a long duration for that mitigation action, including things like monitoring and adaptive management. And there has to be some flexibility built into that arrangement for that offsetting or mitigation. As well, there are situations where around a negotiating table, for instance, for one of the large environmental assessment office kind of permits, there's difficulties and obstacles between the government and the First Nations and the ENGOs and the proponent, where they just can't come to a conclusion about how to deal with a particular contentious issue. The guidance in the document and a worksheet that's a really great structured thinking process for leading you through how to go all the way out to offsetting is very helpful to help the language be shared so that people know what we're talking about, so that you can see how you've actually quantified what that residual impact is and what the mitigation impact is going to be, how that mitigation is going to reduce things back to a no net loss if that's the goal. So a barrier to decisions can be brought, and that has been found to be very helpful in our testing. As well, where there's a First Nations interest or legal obligations, where First Nations accommodation is required, government wants to have this kind of a tool available for good communication as well. And there may be cases where the current condition or trend of a particular significant value is on the table for consideration for mitigation. And that's, again, where it's really helpful to have this tool on the table. And so who's supposed to actually implement the environmental mitigation policy, actually put the things on the ground that this policy will result in. It's the proponent who is going to be responsible for all the mitigation and all the offsetting. All the costs rest with that proponent. So it's the planning, the implementation, the administration, the monitoring, all the maintenance. So let's just talk about offsets. This is the definition that's in the environmental mitigation policy. Counteract or make up for an impact on a component or a value. We don't like to include the word compensation in the definition because usually the word compensation implies some kind of a dollar value. And offsetting, of course, as I said before, can be just a conservation action out on the ground. Doesn't have to. And let's talk about the principles that are presented in the environmental mitigation policy procedures, so the guidance on how to do this well. And particularly, this is all about offsetting. So back to the hierarchy. It's the last resort in the mitigation hierarchy. Don't go there unless you've done everything else first and documented it, shown that you need to go there. The offset measures have to deliver tangible, on-the-ground outcomes for conservation benefits, and the measure needs to be linked to the impact. The additive and incrementality of the measure is an important concept as well, and that is that if something's already required under a statutory requirement of a permit, you can't claim that's an offset. And if government's already doing something, you can't pay them to be doing that in order to be an offset. It has to be something in addition. You can, if they're doing 20 moose surveys and you're going to pay for 100 more, that might be an offset. Other offset principles, like for like, and on-site and in proximity measures should be considered first. As close as possible to what the impact is should be the replacement option. Again, the responsibility rests with the proponent. Offset measures are secured for the duration of the impact. If you've got a 5-year impact time frame, the offset needs to be available during that 5-year time frame, and if the impact is gone after 5 years, then that area or activity that's being conducted as an offset doesn't have to continue into the future. But if you're a mining company and you're taking the top off a mountain, that mountain's not coming back, then that offset needs to be in place in perpetuity. So that means all that planning and maintenance and flexibility into the future all has to be costed into what is that offset. And paying a one-time lump sum can get pretty big for an in perpetuity kind of a offset. And it's hard to estimate what that might be, and certainly those that we've had in the past probably don't reflect that too well. And the last item on here is all about ecological equivalency. We take that residual impact that I mentioned from that diagram, and that is used to identify the risk of proceeding or not proceeding with an offset, and it's also used to help identify the ecological equivalency of the residual impact. And ecological equivalency is linked to the like for like, and there's a definition there from the policy about what we're dealing with for ecological equivalency. The similarity. We want them as similar as possible. Now this is of course all based on the underlying concept of a no net loss. Even if we're not going toward, if the total goal is not no net loss, if we're going for a less than, getting back to that original, we still base our calculations of ecological equivalency and that offset on the no net loss policy, but then we still pull back from what that is. It's an underlying concept. However, if you have an impact site and an offset site, for example, and they're not quite the same because none of them are quite the same. The berry production over here is not quite the same as the berry production over there, or the quality of the stream, et cetera, or the numbers of birds that can live on this south-facing slope versus that south-facing slope. You know they're not quite the same. So if there are differences, or if there's, thank you, if there's some differences, you may need to consider some compensation ratios because of uncertainty about the offset effectiveness, the environmental components, risks, and the timeliness. And so that's how long is it going to take for the trees to grow up into the place where they will be sufficient to replace the habitat that you've damaged. So offsets can be conservation mechanisms or financial mechanisms. I've got a couple of examples listed here. They can be on-site. You can do things on-site above and beyond your regulatory requirement in your permit area. That's still an offset. But the off-site things, you can do restoration as well. And the other things that I've listed on this slide here, you can see probably involve other parties. It's not just that the proponent would be doing these things. The government has to be involved in the land securement. We're in a conservation covenant. And certainly if there's an idea that population management might be a consideration. Proponents aren't going to be out shooting wolves, for instance. Now, because this was about birds and migratory birds, I tried to find examples. Obviously, this isn't a necessarily good example for this crowd, but I tried to find some examples from people about some offsets that have actually been put in place recently for birds, because I couldn't find them for the right group. Anyway, so on the Site C dam, they are predicting or have actually removed 19 bald eagle nests. And the offset, a conservation offset, is a 2-to-1 ratio. They'll be putting up some platforms for bald eagle nests. There's some debate about whether or not that's going to be successful, or whether whether that's the right ratio. But that was what was agreed. It's just an example of a conservation offset. If we move to the financial mechanisms, or in lieu payments, they're often referred to, payment to the province or a third party to implement the conservation measures rather than the proponent doing them, it has to be sufficient to actually address all the costs involved. And I would note that where in BC, where offset agreements have been put in place that involve in lieu payments, usually it's a smaller element of it is the in lieu payment, and there's a lot more of the conservation actions going on as well. So when is it appropriate to have an in lieu payment? Well, the impacts will have to be mitigated across, where the impacts to get mitigated require actions that the proponent is not authorized to do. I was talking about population management. Or where there's multiple proponents in an area affecting the same value, and where putting all the money together for a combined effort would be more effective from a conservation gain. Spotted owl was an example of a financial offset where we have captive breeding being paid for because it was a better conservation outcome than dealing with the habitat or trying to replace the habitat. It's not a great example, but I'll just say it was a financial offset used for, it had adjusted the policy by saying it's the better conservation output. There are some cautions, and this is where we come down to some dirty work. They must ensure that the payments are guaranteed to go towards the intended measures. Most trusts, third-party trusts, have little control by government or little accountability to government. So there's some nervousness about how that money is going to be spent, where it will end up. And that nervousness sits within government, it sits with the proponent, it sits with the First Nations, the ENGOs, and the public. And so it's really necessary to, if there's going to be a third party or arm's length kind of an arrangement, that the governance is really, really strong, and that's got to be set up right at the time of the permit for the offset, so that that is written in stone right at that point. And of course, everything has to be legitimate and legal under the Financial Administration Act, and that particularly is important for those of us within government who receive money, but also, nothing can be done according to, to break any other laws. And so I just wanted to highlight that we are continuing to do some work for policy development under the environmental mitigation policy. We have some projects here, and particularly focusing on receiving and managing offset funds. The key takeaway points I'd like to leave you with this morning are implementation across the NR sector agencies. It is across all the agencies, it is government policy. It's guidance for mitigation planning, it's a decision support tool. Apply the mitigation hierarchy and link your mitigation to the impact. Those are the key statements. It has no new legal requirements. It supports existing legislation. It's not a no net loss policy. These are all things I've mentioned. It's voluntary for proponents, but it sure would be good to know about it and use it and be familiar with it when information comes into an application as an application to government. And it is evolving. And I think I've left a few minutes for questions.